Randy Hass, an anthropologist from the University of California, was working with his colleagues at a high-altitude site in the area known as Willamaya Pajaxta in southern Peru, when they found 6 burials dating back almost 9,000 years, which contained the remains of 6 individuals. During their work, the team collaborated with the local Amara community. Teenage female huntress buried with her tools. One burial pit was not like the others. Based on the hunting toolkit found with the deceased, the team initially thought that the burial was of a male hunter. However, the bones were very slender, light, and appeared to be those of a female. Science quotes one of the team members, bioarchaeologist Jim Watson, as saying, "I think your hunter might be female." Indeed, the grave contained the remains of a young woman who died between the ages of 17 and 19. Her gender and age were determined based on an analysis of proteins in her teeth. Anthropologist Randy Hass has told Sky News that the female hunter had been buried with stone projectile points for felling large animals, a knife and flakes of rock for removing internal organs, and tools for scraping and tanning hides. The stone points would have been attached to shafts and used as spear throwers and hurled at animals with great force. A pigment chunk was also found with her, which was used in the treatment of hides. Was the discovery an outlier? The female hunter was found near the grave of a male who was also buried with a hunting toolkit. The team of researchers also found evidence of animal bones in the sediment of the burial ground, including Andean deer and visuna. Hass told Science News that these 2 animals were the main targets of ancient hunters in that part of the Andes. However, many believe that the find was a one-off and that the female big game hunter was an outlier. Science quotes Meg Conkey, an archaeologist who didn't take part in the study, as stating that skeptics may say it's a one-off. Moreover, the presence of hunting gear in a grave does not necessarily mean that the deceased was a hunter. Hass and his team set out to prove that there had once been other female hunters in the Americas. Hass and his colleagues were prepared for this and conducted an exhaustive study of the research literature on 107 burial sites in the Americas. All of these sites are between 6,000 and 12,500 years old. In total, the researchers found 10 women who had been buried with hunting toolkits. Their research has led them to conclude that women routinely participated in big game hunts. The researchers wrote in Science Advances that the findings are consistent with non-gendered label practices in which early hunter-gatherer females were big game hunters. Based on their study of other sites, the research team believes that females accounted for between 30 and 50% of ancient American big game hunters, reports Science News. They're convinced that the evidence is strong for their theory. The researchers also consider that archaeologists did not recognize that females were big game hunters in the past because of sexism. Gizmodo quotes the researchers as saying that modern gender constructs often do not reflect past ones. In other words, just because women in the recent past were not big game hunters, this does not mean that there weren't any female big game hunters in the Americas 9,000 years ago. Up until recently, the man-the-hunter hypothesis was widely accepted according to science. This held that women did women's work and that males engaged in activities such as hunting and as a result were the dominant gender. This was based in part on modern studies of hunter-gatherer groups such as the Hasda of Tasmania. Inspired by their groundbreaking discovery in Peru, the researchers argue that this was not the case. Big game hunting would have required teamwork, a group of people working together and a great deal of labor. Therefore, women would have had to have cooperated with men to ensure success in hunting expeditions. Quoted in Gizmodo, the researchers argue that there was a broad participation from both females and males in the hunting of big game. Ashley Smallwood of the University of Louisville in Kentucky tells Science News that it's time to stop thinking of ancient female large-game hunters as outliers. The discovery of the ancient female huntress in Peru could transform our knowledge of gender roles in the past. If women hunted, this would imply that there was more equality between the genders in prehistoric societies. However, some have argued against these findings and state that the researchers cannot prove their arguments about female hunters because the sample that they investigated is simply too small. However, the research is aligned with recent discoveries that challenge the traditional assumptions about gender roles in prehistory. Archaeologists have found evidence of a 5,000-year-old female warrior in California, while other finds suggest that there were female fighters in both Mongolian and Viking societies in the distant past. A team of Spanish researchers theorizes, based on grooves and nicks on the teeth of Neanderthals, that gender roles among that species were similar to gender roles of modern Homo sapiens. Neanderthal men prepared the cutting tools and weapons, while women saw to the leather garments and clothing. But there was at least one duty that men and women may have shared. Neanderthal women, these researchers think, hunted big game with the men. Almudena Estelarich, a researcher at the Spanish National Museum of Natural Sciences, said, "We believe that the specialization of labor by sex of the individuals was probably limited to a few tasks, as it is possible that both men and women participated equally in the hunting of big animals." Another researcher on the project, Antonio Rosas, along with the museum, told phys.org, "The study of Neanderthals has provided numerous discoveries in recent years. We have moved from thinking of them as little evolved beings to know that they took care of the sick people, buried their deceased, ate seafood, and even had different physical features than expected. There were red-headed individuals and with light skin and eyes. So far, we thought that the sexual division of labor was typical of sapient societies, but apparently that's not true." A study of ancient DNA by other researchers showed a mutation that may have resulted in red hair and light skin among Neanderthals, according to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. An article on the Smithsonian's website says 2 Neanderthals, one from Spain and one from Italy, had a mutation in a gene controlling skin and hair color. The mutation changes an amino acid, making the resulting protein less efficient. Modern humans have other MCR1 variants that are also less active, resulting in red hair and pale skin. The less active Neanderthal mutation probably also resulted in red hair and pale skin, as in modern humans. Phys.org says that one of the main conclusions of a study of 99 incisors and canines of 19 Neanderthal people showed that their communities divided work according to sex. The study, by the Spanish National Research Council, was published in the Journal of Human Evolution. The Neanderthals' teeth came from sites at El Sidron, Asturias, Spain, Spy, Belgium, and Lourdes, France. The study said grooves in the teeth of women appeared to follow the same pattern. The pattern of the grooves in women's teeth differed from that in men's. Analysis shows that all Neanderthals, regardless of age, had grooves in their teeth. This is due to the custom of these societies to use the mouth as a third hand, as in some current populations, for tasks such as preparing the furs for chopping meat, for instance. The researchers found that the grooves in men's teeth were longer than women's and made the assumption from this that the tasks the two sexes performed differed. Also, they found tiny nicks in the enamel and dentin of the upper teeth of men and in the lower teeth of women. Researchers are unable to make rock-solid conclusions about which tasks men performed and which tasks women performed, but they said in modern hunter-gatherer society, women typically prepare furs and other garments, and men retouch the edges of stone tools. They say this may have been how it was among the Neanderthals they studied. The remains of an ancient domesticated dog that spent its life with humans has been unearthed in an Italian cave. Believe it or not, this ancient domesticated dog is now considered to be Europe's earliest pet dog and might be 20,000 years old. How wolves became wolf-like and then are early friends. The early ancestors of grey wolves, Canis lupus, were a group of carnivores named the creodonts that roamed the northern hemisphere between 100 and 120 million years ago. About 55 million years ago, this ancient species gave rise to the carnassials, a group of wolf-like animals that had specialized jaws and razor-sharp teeth for tearing and eating meat. One member of this family, Miakis, is thought to be the common ancestor of all present-day wolves, bears, raccoons, weasels, and dogs. Researchers hope this incredible discovery in Italy will provide new information on how and when dogs diverged from wolves and became domesticated human pets. Dr. Francesco Boschkin heads the team of archaeologists from the University of Siena in Italy that published the study on the Italian canid and wolf remains found in the caves. According to an article in Scientific Reports, he stated it might be the oldest ever remains of a domesticated pet dog found in Europe. The animal remains are expected to be somewhere between 14 and 20,000 years old. This was the time when humans and canines first began a mutually beneficial relationship that eventually made our dogs our best friends. Solving the hows and whys of early canine domestication. For millions of years, humans and wild wolves shared the same hunting landscapes. While it's unknown exactly when domesticated dogs, Canis familiaris, evolved from the great wolves, we do have some important scientific clues. A 2009 study published in the Molecular Biology and Evolution journal cites an analysis of ancient dog mitochondrial DNA that suggests they evolved alongside wolves over 100,000 years ago. Thus, many experts believe canines began scavenging due to a lack of food and that humans slowly developed a bond with these animals that also acted as an early warning if larger creatures approached a campsite or entered a cave. Some scientists believe wolves and early humans hunted together, and this is how the relationship was formed. The latest study by Dr. Boschkin and his team focused on bone fragments from ancient canines and wolves found at two Paleolithic caves in southern Italy, the Paglici Cave and the Romanelli Cave. These ancient animals, according to the research, are the first dogs to live alongside humans as a pet. Furthermore, according to an article in the Daily Mail, the ancient canine-human connection offers a definitive answer to the long-standing question of how and when dogs first became pets. Anyone who has a dog or has experienced losing one knows the depth of uniqueness of that special bond. But why and when in the history of our planet did this love affair between humans and dogs begin? Discover the history of dogs and human interaction. The earliest known ancestors of grey wolves, a major figure in the history of dogs, are called creodonts. They roamed the northern hemisphere between 100 and 120 million years ago. By 55 million years ago, these pack-hunting carnivores gave rise to the carnassials, wolf-like animals that had jaws for tearing and devouring meat. One member of this family, known as Miakis, existed between 60 and 55 million years ago and is thought by mainstream scientists to be the common ancestor of all present-day wolves, dogs, bears, and raccoons. About 45 million years ago, up to around 2 million years ago, a massive species known as bear dogs roamed across North America, Europe, Africa, and Asia, sharing hunting plains with Canis lupus, one of the closest relatives to the modern grey wolf. Around 25 million years ago, a species called Cynodictis split in two evolutionary branches, resulting in African hunting dogs and Eurasian wolves and dogs. At this time in North America, the clans were dominated by the fearsome Tomarctus, equipped with razor-sharp claws, a powerful biting jaw, and a long tail for balance while hunting and fighting. Up until 2010, most experts believe domestication occurred about 14,000 years ago, but studies of dog mitochondrial DNA strongly suggest they evolved alongside each other 100,000 years ago. Supporting this new paradigm, in 2009, several ritually buried dog skulls were discovered in a cave in the Czech Republic, which dated to 30,000 BC. Furthermore, in 2011, a Paleolithic dog skeleton dated to 30,000 BC was found biting a large mammoth bone, and its brain had been carefully removed sometime after death, suggesting it held ritual significance. Another dog skull dated to 31,000 BC was found buried with a human body in a cave in Siberia, not only telling archaeologists that the man had domesticated hunting dogs, but they had played an important role within his supernatural belief system. The relationship between humans and dogs was cemented at the dawn of farming, when people realized just how quickly a wolf could be domesticated with starch. Having sharp teeth, strong jaws, and speed, semi-tamed wolves were used to protect small hunting stations and in return were rewarded with companionship, protection, shelter, and a reliable food source. By 6000 BC, dogs were being trained as effective farming tools and weapons used at times of intertribal fighting, and these inherent ancient skills are still evident today in different dog breeds, for example guard dogs, police dogs, military dogs, sheepdogs, and rat catchers. The rise of organized religions led to the ritualization of dogs, and they were generally associated with the human soul's journey in the afterlife. Canine deities were worshipped in ancient China, Egypt, and South America, where they were carved into statues and temples and featured centrally in mythologies and legends. Evidence of the ritualization of dogs was found in the skeleton of a male husky-like dog that lived 7,000 years ago in Siberia that had worked alongside humans throughout his lifetime, ate human food, and was ritually buried as though it were a human. What is more, a wild wolf was ritualistically buried nearby, perhaps once perceived as protecting human souls on their journey through the afterlife. Around 2000 BC, the Iron Age saw Romans, Egyptians, Greeks, and Britons increasingly using dogs in warfare, blood sports, and violent entertainment. Larger breeds such as the Mastiff and Wolfhound were found to be effective in war, and the ancient Roman history Strabo reported in 38 AD of large British dogs which were bred in their homeland of Britannia to hunt dangerous game as war dogs. In 43 AD, at the Roman conquest of Britain, a procurer called Syneggi was recorded as selecting dogs for exporting to Rome to either compete in the amphitheatre or to join the Roman army as war dogs. He mentioned a wide-mouthed giant dog that surpassed the Roman Molossus dog. What does the future have in store for dogs and us? Today, like in so many aspects of life, dogs have become extremely polarized, and we have specially trained medical dogs that detect cancers and smell when diabetic patients are suffering hypoglycemia, low blood sugars. This is all happening as astronaut dogs are being trained in space programs and search and rescue dogs leap from helicopters and speedboats, not to mention military dogs that can detect explosives and locate injured bodies in places deemed too dangerous for soldiers. A highlight in research for this article was learning that in 1943, during World War II, the American Army began a war dog training program which parachuted puppies into war zones to sniff out enemy tunnels and bunkers. What on earth will dogs be doing in the future? In the modern police and army, dogs that are trained to bite often suffer from broken teeth, which are now being replaced with sharp titanium fangs at a cost of between $600 and $2,000 a tooth. Is this the beginning of a new evolutionary path for canines? Like us, will we soon be able to sync our dogs with our computers and smartphones? In conclusion, the evolution of dogs that has spanned nearly 45 million years is far from complete, and although we have altered its course irreversibly with mass breeding over the last 200 years, so far no other animal has evolved to live alongside humans as harmoniously as dogs have. Scientists have uncovered decorated artifacts dating from between 40,000 and 75,000 years ago from Tanzania and the southern tip of South Africa that show that man developed the capacity for symbolic thought long before previously believed. The discovery of these artifacts could present huge problems to conventional thinking about human history. The earliest kind of decoration used by humans was probably ochre, which we know was used over 200,000 years ago in the Middle Stone Age and Middle Paleolithic. The earliest evidence of its use in Africa dates back 285,000 years. Ochre is an umbrella term for a range of earthy, iron-rich rocks composed of iron oxides or oxyhydroxides such as shales, sandstones, mudstones, and specularite. In Africa, ochre is still used for protection from the sun and against insects such as mosquitoes. It has also been scientifically proven to inhibit the effect of UV radiation and also has many other uses. Fascinatingly, ochre appears in the archaeological record around the same time as anatomically modern humans, and became more frequently used from about 100,000 years ago at many Middle Stone Age sites. One of the most often debated questions in the study of early man is, when did the origins of modern human behavior begin? When and where did our common ancestors first begin to behave in ways similar to ourselves? Although it is well known that Homo sapiens were anatomically modern by 200,000 years ago in Africa, there's never been evidence to support the idea that these humans could be capable of modern behavior. But all that changed with the discovery of the Blombos heads on the 24th of April 2004 by a team of scientists led by Dr. Christopher Henshelwood, a South African archaeologist affiliated with the University of Bergen in Norway and the State University of New York at Stony Brook. The discovery was made at Blombos Cave on the shore of the Indian Ocean 200 miles east of Cape Town. Archaeologists now believe that due to these and other findings, most ancient symbolic traditions in Africa date back at least 100,000 years. Years after these amazing discoveries, new discoveries relating to early Homo sapiens' cognitive abilities are still challenging mainstream views. The archaeological site at Blombos Cave contains Middle Stone Age archaeological deposits, including hearths, bone, stone, marine shells and sand in discrete layers dated to between 100,000 and 72,000 years ago. This is seen by many researchers as probably the most important period in the early development of modern human behavior. Published results from Blombos Cave indicate that some aspects of modern behavior evolved during the early-late Pleistocene after 100,000 years ago in Africa. Excavations at the cave match recent and older findings from a number of African Middle Stone Age sites that date to this time period. The discoveries at the cave show that people apparently had the intention to make a statement about themselves with jewelry about 30,000 years earlier than any previously identified personal ornaments used by our human ancestors. This was the conclusion of the archaeologists, who discovered a collection of tiny shells pierced with holes, as if they had been prepared for stringing as primitive beads. The 41 pea-sized shell beads were uncovered in groups arranged by sizes and shade, each cluster probably representing a single piece of jewelry. According to researchers, the strings of bead represent the oldest, well-dated examples of people making and wearing jewelry. This can be interpreted as further evidence that these people possessed a language capable of sharing the symbolic meanings of these objects. 2 years before the discovery of the beads, Dr. Henshelwood reported the discovery of other evidence of possibly complex symbolic thinking by the inhabitants of Blombos Cave, including abstract engravings and finely worked bone tools and weapon points. The shell beads of Blombos Cave were from a small snail-like mollusk, which must have been brought by the group from rivers more than 10 miles away. All the recovered shells from Blombos Cave were carefully pierced around 75,000 years ago using a bone tool to create a keyhole perforation. These were then strung and worn as a personal ornament. Archaeologists discovered signs of repeated rubbing on the beads, a sign that they had been rubbed against one another and against the cord, resulting in discrete use-wear surfaces on each bead. Such patterns of wear are not present on the shells in their natural environment. Microscopic residues of ochre discovered inside some of the beads probably resulted from deliberate coloring by the wearer or perhaps by transfer when worn. Henshelwood and other researchers believe that this small but growing record of very early artistic artifacts from Africa are vital evidence that modern behavioral traits, such as the use of external symbols, developed slowly over a couple of 100,000 years, not abruptly after our ancestors emerged from Africa, as some archaeologists have suggested. However, not all researchers agreed with Dr. Henshelwood's interpretation that these mysterious artifacts were expressions of a modern type of creativity. Indeed, a few of them have even questioned whether the shells were actually used as beads. Archaeologist Randall White of New York University, for example, does not believe that humans made the holes in the snail shells, saying, "I'm disturbed by the fact that there are no tool traces." Up until the discoveries in Blombos Cave, the earliest African personal ornaments were 13 ostrich eggshell beads from Kenya, dated to 40 to 45,000 years ago. Other, slightly more recent evidence includes a 43,000-year-old perforated teeth from Bulgaria and 41,000-year-old marine beads from Turkey. Discoveries in Tanzania. In 2000, archaeologists reported finding ostrich eggshell beads as well as ochre pencils and fish bones at a site in the Serengeti National Park of Tanzania. The archaeologists were not able to date the two carved donut-shaped pieces of ostrich shell precisely, but they came from the same layer as tools from the African Middle Stone Age between 280,000 and 45,000 years ago. For some reason, the mysterious discovery was not announced until 4 years later, in March 2004, at the Paleoanthropology Society meeting in Montreal. Despite the uncertainty over their exact age, one of the archaeologists who discovered the beads, Curtis Marian, from the Institute of Human Origins and Department of Anthropology at Arizona State University, stated that they were unambiguous examples of symbolic behavior. What is modern human behavior? But why do decorated beads mean that we may have discovered the earliest examples of modern human thinking? Research has shown that symbols cannot exist in isolation, but generally form a part of interlinked systems. Modern human behavior is usually defined as behavior that is caused by socially constructed patterns of symbolic thinking, actions, and communication. The capacity for symbolic thought is not the main defining factor for modern human behavior, but rather it is the use of symbolism to organize behavior that defines us. So, early humans were first behaviorally modern when symbols became an inherent part of their daily lives. In basic terms, this means that people were using the artifacts that they made to organize their social world in a similar way as we do today. Within each group of people, such as those at the Blombos Caves, artifacts may have had meanings that could be understood only by members of that group. A good example is the design of the bead necklace discovered in the cave, which may have carried a significant meaning that was not understood by people outside the group. The findings from Blombos Cave and from Tanzania, and the subsequent reanalysis and excavation of other relevant sites have resulted in a clear change in our understanding of the timing and location of the development of modern human behavior. Archaeologists believe that these discoveries undoubtedly reflect the acquisition of completely modern cognitive abilities by southern African populations at least 100,000 years ago. Although scientists are aware that these are vastly important discoveries in terms of early man, they still seem to be a little reluctant to believe very early dates. Randall White commented, "If the dates hold up, we now seem to be seeing a trail of representational objects that is increasingly older as we move back from Europe into Africa." A skeleton dubbed Littlefoot, discovered in South Africa in the 1990s, is claimed to be the most complete ancient hominin in the fossil record. The results of recent analysis into the skeleton have caused controversy, as researchers claim that Littlefoot actually lived some 3.67 million years ago, about a million years earlier than previous claims, and that the fossil probably represents a previously unknown species related to humans. In 1994, Ronald Clark, a paleoanthropologist at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, was examining boxes of fossils at a field laboratory at the Sterfontein Caves, about 25 miles northwest of Johannesburg. The collection had previously been thought to contain nothing but ancient monkey bones. When he came upon a group of small bones in the collection, he immediately realized that they belonged to an early hominin. Clark later established that the bones seemed to have belonged to an ancient species of ape-like hominins that were present in Africa between about 4 million and 2 million years ago, before the human genus Homo became dominant. In 1997, Clark came upon more bones from the skeleton at a nearby medical school and decided he would search for more of the Littlefoot skeleton in the cave itself. But it was to take until 2012 to locate and remove all traces of Littlefoot from the cave. Study researcher Robin Crompton, A musculoskeletal biologist at the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom said that the excavations proved much more difficult than at first thought. This was mainly because the bones themselves were softer than the rock surrounding them. Once in possession of the remains, though, even more difficult work lay ahead. Clark said of the recovery of the skeleton, "We used very small tools like needles to excavate it. That's why it took so long. It was like excavating a fluffy pastry out of concrete." In December 2018, it was finally revealed that after 20 years of excavating in South Africa, researchers had completely recovered and cleaned the most complete skeleton of an approximately 3.67-million-year-old hominin nicknamed Littlefoot. Initial theories were that the Littlefoot fossil is a female who exhibited some of the earliest signs of human-like bipedal walking. Fascinatingly, she may also belong to a distinct species that most researchers haven't previously recognized. The nickname Littlefoot came from the small size of the foot bones that were among the first parts of the skeleton to be discovered. The newly discovered Littlefoot specimen is more than 90% complete, which far exceeds the amount of remains of its more famous cousin Lucy, whose skeleton is about 40% complete. The skeleton's relatively small build and certain skull features suggested to the researchers that it was probably a female of advanced age, with a brain size of about 408 cubic centimeters, about one-third the size of modern human brains. The woman seemed to have suffered a forearm injury early in life, and her comparatively long legs in proportion to her arms means that she had similar proportions to those of modern humans. Littlefoot is the oldest known hominin to have this feature, which suggests that she probably walked upright more than she swung through trees. Researchers stated that Littlefoot was probably 4 foot 3 inches tall and also vegetarian. According to Robin Crompton, "My analysis of her skeleton shows that she and the rest of the local population of her species at that time were under active natural selection for an ability to walk efficiently, fully upright on the ground over medium to long distances." Examination of the skeletal remains showed that Littlefoot had sustained an arm injury early in life. However, this injury had healed long before she fell into the cave where she was found and died. The fatal fall may have been during a struggle with a large monkey, as the skeleton of one was found very close to her, said Crompton. Based in part on the examination of her teeth and hips, researchers believe Littlefoot represents a new species. The name had previously been given to a hominin skull fragment found in South Africa in 1948, but it was withdrawn after researchers decided that the skull probably belonged to an unusual Africanus. However, Lee Berger, an archaeologist at the University of Witwatersrand, who was not involved with the latest research into the skeleton, but is working on publications about Littlefoot, stated that if Littlefoot is actually a newly identified species, which he is far from convinced is the case, then she should have a new species name and not reuse an old undefined one. But Crompton disagreed. After the Australopithecus africanus specimen was properly named, Clark began using that name for other bone fragments found in the cave. He said on the naming issue, "It's a bad practice and against the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature to create new names where a valid name already exists, and no good argument for separation into a different species exists." So as Professor Clark did not have evidence that Littlefoot was part of a different species, and he continued to use that name for the fossils in the published scientific literature, it was entirely appropriate that he used the existing and valid name. Berger is also concerned about the lack of solid information in the recently published papers on the Littlefoot skeleton. He believes there should be more detailed measurements of the fossil bones. For instance, there's no data. There are almost no measurements of the fossils, he says. Berger hopes one day to provide the missing data in his own publications, although he is still at an early stage of the analysis. The researchers suggest that these specimens are potentially an ancestor of a group of hominins called the Paranthropus 4, which coexisted with early Homo species for about 1 million years. Much more controversy has arisen over the dating of the Littlefoot fossil. Based on the age of the sediments around the fossil, The researchers have dated Littlefoot to around 3.67 million years ago, about a million years earlier than previous dates for the skeleton. This would mean Littlefoot was alive about 500,000 years before Lucy in Ethiopia. The date would mean that our ancient ancestors were almost certainly scattered across Africa. Some researchers are unconvinced that the skeleton itself is as old as the sediments in which it was found. Fred Grein, a paleoanthropologist at Stony Brook, New York, quipped, "We buried a dead squirrel in our backyard in November 2014, but I think the sand surrounds it dates back to the last glacial retreat on Long Island." He argues that millions of years after the sand crystals washed into the cave, a larger opening could have formed, allowing an ancient human ancestor to fall in. Dal Granger, however, is aware of the dating problems. Dating cave sediments and their fossils is difficult. We know so much about the timing of hominid evolution in East Africa because there are many datable volcanic ashes associated with the fossil sites. In places like South Africa, there are no volcanic ashes to date. The cave sediments themselves can be very complicated, with sediment falling into multiple entrances, collapsing into lower sections, and overlapping each other. In March 2020, it was reported in the media that a high-resolution micro-CT scanning of the skull of Littlefoot has revealed some aspects of how this species used to live more than 3 million years ago. The work was undertaken by University of Witwatersrand team, which included lead researcher Dr. Amélie Boudet. By comparing the Littlefoot with other fossils from South and East Africa, as well as living humans and chimpanzees, the team showed that it was capable of head movements that differ from modern humans. In the summary of the paper, the doctor states, "In particular, the nearly complete atlas of Littlefoot has the potential to provide new insights into the evolution of head mobility and the arterial supply to the brain in the human lineage. Our study shows that it was capable of head movements that differ from us. This could be explained by the greater ability of them to climb and move in trees. However, a southern African specimen younger than Littlefoot, probably younger by about 1 million years, may have partially lost this capacity and spent more time on the ground, like us today." One aspect of the new research appears to contradict, to some extent, earlier conclusions about Littlefoot's movement. The new study found that the overall dimensions and shape of the atlas, the topmost bone sitting just below the skull of Littlefoot, are similar to living chimpanzees. More specifically, the ligament insertions and the morphology of the facet joints linking the head and the neck all suggest that Littlefoot was moving regularly in trees rather than mainly on the ground, as was previously believed. Ancient hominin bones discovered in northern Spain's Atapuerca Mountains have pushed back the arrival of humans in Europe to roughly 1.2 million years ago, around 500,000 years earlier than once believed. Fascinatingly, only about 1/10 of the site's total area has been excavated, which means there may be many more important discoveries in store. One mystery of the site the archaeologists have so far been unable to solve is how the remains of 32 individuals accumulated at the bottom of a narrow cave shaft at the site. The discovery of Atapuerca. Atapuerca is the site of a number of limestone caves near Burgos in northern Spain, known for the abundant fossil record of the earliest human beings in Europe, dating back almost 1 million years. The sites at Atapuerca have been known since the end of the 19th century, but it was not until the 1950s that any details of the site became known, when the Edelweiss Caving Club, ECC of Burgos, northern Spain, began to catalogue and map Cueva Maya at Atapuerca. In 1962, ECC members reported fossils in the railway cutting to the local authorities. A decade later, the ECC discovered the Gallery of Flint, and in 1976 they located hominid skulls in the Pit of Bones. Paleontologist Emiliano Aguirre began investigating sites at Atapuerca soon afterwards, and in 1978 put together a research project for the first excavations there, which he led until 1991, when he retired and handed over the leadership of the Atapuerca research project. Oldest European. In March 2008, it was announced that Spanish paleontologists had unearthed the remains of a 1.2 million-year-old human-like inhabitant of Western Europe in the caves at Atapuerca. According to the researcher, the fossil find demonstrates that members of our genus, Homo, colonized this region far earlier than previously believed. The primitive hominin is represented by a fragment of jawbone bearing a few teeth. Although stone tools of a similar age to the fossil jawbone, from about 1.2 to 1.5 million years old, had previously been discovered in France, Italy and Spain, this is the first verifiable human material of this date. This lends support to the theory that the tools found in the vicinity were made by primitive humans. According to Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in London, when combined with the emerging archaeological evidence, it suggests that southern Europe began to be colonized from Western Asia not long after humans had emerged from Africa, something which many of us would have doubted even 5 years ago. The Pit of Bones. One of the sites at Atapuerca, Grandalina, contains human remains which have been dated to about 800,000 years ago, as well as some of the earliest tools ever found in Western Europe. But perhaps the most fascinating discovery at Atapuerca was a cave called the Pit of Bones, where 43 feet down, more than 1,600 human fossils, including several nearly complete skulls, were found. The materials in the pit dates back to between 600,000 and 300,000 years and represents about 28 individuals whose brain sizes are within the range of both Neanderthals and modern humans. This represents the world's largest collection in any one place of ancient human fossils. Compared to modern humans, these people were short, stocky, and had smaller brains. It has been estimated males were about 5'7" tall and weighed around 170 pounds, whereas females stood around 5'2" and weighed 125 pounds. The skeletons exhibit a number of characteristics unique to Neanderthals, including a projecting midface, long and narrow pubic bones, and thick finger bones. However, unlike later Neanderthals, they do not fully express the characteristic Neanderthal form. The site also contained a 430,000-year-old fractured skull, which has been interpreted as the earliest evidence of interpersonal violence in Homo. Also discovered in the pit were the bones of cave bears. It's believed that the bears fell down the shaft by accident, probably while seeking places to hibernate. But what the human bones were doing there can only be imagined. No signs of tool butchery or other food remains were discovered, and a single stone hand axe was the only tool discovered in the pit, fashioned from a type of stone not known in the area. Researchers have proposed various hypotheses to explain how the fossils got there. According to one theory, the bodies may have been purposely dropped by their relatives in some kind of ritual burial. This would push back the origin of mortuary practices in humans substantially. Thus far, the earliest accepted burials only occur after 130,000 years ago among Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. However, other researchers believe it is more than likely that the bodies were deliberately dropped there after meeting violent ends. The hominins may also have been dragged there by carnivores, carried by floodwaters, or even been trapped after venturing too far. In August 2016, a study of the human remains from the Pit of Bones was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science. It identified trauma on 8 skulls from the pit. Part of the abstract of the study reads, "The fractures found in 17 crania from SH display a post-mortem fracturation pattern, which occurred in the dry bone stage and is compatible with collective burial assemblages. Nevertheless, in addition to the post-mortem fractures, 8 crania also display some typical peri-mortem traumas. Interpersonal violence as a cause for the peri-mortem fractures can be confirmed for one of the skulls, cranium 17, and also probable for cranium 5 and cranium 11. For the rest of the crania, although other causes cannot be absolutely ruled out, the violence-related traumas are the most plausible scenario for the peri-mortem fractures. If this hypothesis is confirmed, we could interpret that interpersonal violence was a recurrent behavior in this population from the Middle Pleistocene." It would appear from the results of this study that at least some of those in the pit suffered a violent end at the hands of other members of the population in the area. However, this still doesn't explain how and why the dead bodies were taken into the cave chamber. Perhaps the perpetrators wanted to hide their victims, or maybe relatives interred the corpses in the pit. We shall probably never know for sure. DNA evidence. In December 2013, it was revealed that a thigh bone from the pit of bones had yielded 400,000-year-old DNA, by far the oldest human DNA ever sequenced. Previously, the oldest human DNA sequenced came from bones that were less than 120,000 years old. Astonishingly, the results suggested that the thigh bone belonged to a previously unknown human species, which some researchers believe may even be a missing link between Neanderthals and their mysterious cousins, the Denisovans. Paleontologists believe this result brings us nearer than ever before to understanding who our own common ancestor with the Neanderthals was. According to Chris Stringer, the genomes we have up until now are really very recent. This takes us at least a few 100,000 years back towards our common ancestor with other hominins. The researchers had expected the DNA to resemble Neanderthal, but it proved to be quite distinct, most closely resembling that of the mysterious Denisovans, a species known only from a finger bone and 2 teeth discovered in a Siberian cave. Stringer admitted that they were somewhat baffled by this result, and there is no evidence that the Denisovans ranged anywhere near Atapuerca. One possibility considered by the researchers is that the fossils belong to the common ancestor of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and some of their descendants later traveled east and became the Denisovans. The genome recovered from the pit of bones is particularly relevant, as it is from a period that is extremely close to the origin of our human line. The archaeological evidence indicates that these early humans were developing important new ways of behaving, though they were still using fairly primitive stone tools like the crafted hand axe, which researchers have nicknamed Excalibur, that was found in the pit. But the bones also suggest more sophisticated traits. One of these traits is the use of the pit as an early burial site, part of a very simple funeral rite. Chris Stringer has even suggested that Excalibur may have been some kind of tribute to the dead. The discovery in the pit of the deformed skull of a girl, who lived to be about 12 years old, also reiterates this more modern behavior, suggesting that the tribe cared for her. There's a hint of something human caring for the disabled, says Stringer. Latest research. In March 2016, a paper was published in the journal Nature, describing a DNA study which, to the surprise of many, identified the remains of the pit bones as Neanderthal. Using this information, the researchers were able to push back the date when the separation between our family branch and that of Neanderthals to sometime between 550,000 and almost 800,000 years ago. In 2019, a comparative study was published of the dental evolution of a number of human species, including the Neanderthals of the pit of bones. These results revealed that the divergence between modern humans and Neanderthals must have occurred at least 800,000 years ago. The question of when and how the continent of Australia was first populated has always been a bit of a puzzle to archaeologists, but recently some new light has been shed on the problem. An international team of archaeologists, geographers, ecologists and computer scientists mapped the probable superhighways that led to the first peopling of the Australian continent around 50,000 to 70,000 years ago. The team generated a fascinating map which reveals these migration superhighways traversed by early humans in Australia, which mysteriously bear striking similarities to Australia's modern highways and stock routes. Some researchers have also suggested a connection between these newly discovered superhighways and the mysterious Aboriginal dreaming tracks. Over the years, there have been many theories about where the indigenous ancestors first settled in Australia tens of thousands of years ago, but evidence for this activity is extremely scarce. Only a very small number of archaeological sites date from these early times when sea levels were much lower and northern Australia was joined by a land bridge to present-day southern New Guinea and eastern Indonesia, and people and animals were able to walk at various times across to Tasmania from the mainland. This megacontinent, known as Sahul, was 30% larger than Australia is today. One of these early archaeological sites was at the now dry Lake Mungo in western New South Wales. Here, in 1968, Earth scientist Jim Bowler uncovered the cremated remains of an Aboriginal woman in an eroding dune close to the shoreline of the lake. In 1974, the ancient remains of a man were found nearby. Both of these remains, now called Mungo Lady and Mungo Man, were found to date back to a staggering 40,000 years, thus doubling scientific estimates of how long Aboriginal people had lived in Australia. The amazing discoveries at Lake Mungo reveal that Aboriginal history stretched back at times so remote that the only humans in Europe were Neanderthals, and people had not yet reached America. By about 70,000 years ago, modern humans, Homo sapiens, began moving into Southeast Asia, where they would probably have encountered existing groups of archaic humans like Homo erectus, Homo floresiensis, often referred to as the hobbits, and possibly also the mysterious Denisovans. In May 2021, it was announced that researchers had used supercomputers to simulate 125 billion possible travel routes and reconstruct the most likely superhighways. The first humans to arrive in Australia used to navigate across this new land more than 65,000 years ago. The international team of scientists who undertook the research was led by researchers from the Australian Research Council Centre of Excellence for Australian Biodiversity and Heritage, CABAR, and recently revealed some of their methods to the press. They said, "We think people navigated in new territories much as people do today, by focusing on prominent land features protruding above the relative flatness of the Australian continent. To map these features, we built the most complete digital elevation model for Sahul ever constructed, including areas now underwater. We used this digital elevation model to understand what was visible to early travelers. Essentially, from each point in the continent we asked, 'What can you see from here?' This moving window calculates the largest viewshed map ever created. When our virtual travelers move, they reorient based on visible terrain everywhere they go." For their work, the researchers created an imaginary traveler, a 25-year-old woman carrying 10 kilograms of supplies to traverse the landscape. They collected all the various pieces of data they accumulated into a mega model known as From Everywhere to Everywhere, FEAT, and created over 125 billion possible pathways from every spot on the continent to everywhere else. Each route represented the easiest way to move from one location to another. Obviously, the researchers could not possibly examine every path of the 125 billion pathways that they had created, so they reduced the number by comparing all plausible pathways with the distribution of the oldest known archaeological sites on the ancient continent, providing weighted possibilities for each path. This work produced a scale of pathways going from the most likely to the least likely chosen paths. The most likely pathways in the map above are what the researchers called the superhighways of the first indigenous populations on the continent. The team's conclusion, drawn from their computer-generated maps, is that the early populations spread across the now submerged wide plains on the western and eastern margins of the continent and through to the region that now forms the Gulf of Carpentaria, the large shallow sea which now connects Australia to New Guinea. The nagging question of whether there was evidence that anyone had actually used these computer-identified highways in the remote past was soon answered by their research. A large number of archaeological sites in Australia, known to be at least 35,000 years old, were located on or near these superhighways, and many tracks also coincided with ancient trade routes known from the oral histories of the indigenous people, or agreed with genetic and linguistic studies used to trace early human migrations. But these superhighways may well have been much more than routes used for the initial peopling of Sahul. A number of these superhighways identified by the research team follow well-known Aboriginal trade routes which cross the country. These include the route from Cape York to South Australia via Birdsville, used by traders of Pituri native tobacco, and the trade of Kimberley Baler shell into Central Australia. There are also obvious similarities between the researchers' map of ancient highways and the most common trading and stock routes used by early Europeans, which is not surprising as they followed established routes long used by the Aboriginal peoples. The researchers' groundbreaking work on these superhighways has impressed the archaeological community. Archaeologist Kyle Bokinski of the University of Montana, Missoula, said, "This is a really compelling illustration of the power of using these simulation techniques at a huge continental scale to understand how people navigate landscapes. It's impressive, extreme computing." One intriguing aspect of this new research is that it has revealed major routes that cut across several dry areas in Australia's centre and in the northeastern state of Queensland. The existence of paths in such locations would appear to challenge the long-held view that the earliest people on the continent avoided the deserts. Kabah Deputy Director, Distinguished Professor Sean Ulm from James Cook University, commented on the importance of the research team's work in revealing the significance of landscape to the native inhabitants of the continent. He said, "Australia is not only the driest but also the flattest populated continent on Earth. Our research shows that prominent landscape features and water sources were critical for people to navigate and survive on the continent. In many Aboriginal societies, landscape features are believed to have been created by ancestral beings during the dreaming. Every ridgeline, hill, river, beach and water source is named, storied and inscribed into the very fabric of societies, emphasizing the intimate relationship between people and place. The landscape is literally woven into people's lives and their histories. It seems that these relationships between people and the country probably date back to the earliest peopling of the continent." This quote brings in a question of a connection between these newly revealed superhighways and Aboriginal dreaming tracks. To the Aborigine, a dreaming track or songline, as it is also known, is a route taken by ancestral heroes in the dreamtime, in which all Aboriginal culture has its roots and before which, in their minds, the Earth did not exist. As with the ancient superhighways, these mostly invisible paths or tracks usually connect Aboriginal sacred sites. In the dreamtime, groups of ancestral beings journeyed across the land, performing mighty deeds and creating the living species and features of the desert landscape. The adventure of these ancestors, also referred to as totemic ancestors, are chronicled in sacred songs, stories, and rituals. These totemic ancestors also established the rules of Aboriginal religion, law, moral systems, and social life. In the mind of the Aborigine dreamtime is a true record of how the landscape was formed, a landscape which is still inhabited by the spirits of their ancestor beings. By reenacting the myths in the dreamtime in song, story, and ceremony, the Aborigines keep their ancestors' rules, beliefs, and relationships with the landscape alive. The massive rock form of Ayers Rock, Uluru in the local Anagu language, is an isolated sandstone outcrop rising 1,140 feet above the Red Desert Plain in the Northern Territory of Central Australia, 208 miles southwest of Alice Springs. This sacred place is seen by the Anangu as a living record of the dreamtime activities of their ancestors, and the appearance and origin of every feature of the giant rock is present on the mental map carried around by the Anangu people of the area. One reason why the local Anangu population prefer tourists not to climb the rock is that the hiking path crosses one of the many traditional dreaming tracks on the site. Hopefully future work on possible connections between these fascinating superhighways and Aboriginal dreaming tracks might reveal important insights into the spiritual nature of both.